this last panel is promises to end the day in good style here. We are going to turn to a broader discussion about commercial applications of quantum technology with our final panel titled Applied Quantum Technology, Making Useful Quantum Technology a Commercial Reality. For this, we've assembled another great panel of experts that will also be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Parker, and I will introduce them in the order that they will present. So Dr. Celia Meersbacher is the Executive Director of the Quantum Economic Development Consortium, a consortium that aims to enable and grow the U.S. quantum industry. Dr. Meersbacher is also the U.S. co-chair of the Quad Investors Network's Quantum Center of Excellence and serves as an advisor to several quantum research organizations. Previous positions include Vice President for Innovative Partnerships at the Semiconductor Research Corporation, Assistant Director for Technology R&D in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and Executive Director of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Next, we will hear from Dr. Akisa Goban, who is co-founder and Chief Technology Officer at Nanofiber Quantum Technologies, or NanoQT, where he leads the scientific and engineering innovations in building quantum computing technologies with nanofiber cavities and neutral atom arrays. Prior to his current position, Dr. Goban was instrumental in developing the most precise atomic clocks at JILA, University of Colorado Boulder, when he was a postdoctoral researcher. Our final speaker will be Mr. Paul Lippman, who is the Chief Commercial Officer at Inflection, where he leads productization and growth efforts on cutting-edge quantum technology. Previous positions saw Mr. Lippman lead multiple successful cybersecurity companies, as well as extensive experience leading complex global organizations and transforming cultures, sales execution, and innovation delivery. Panel, over to you.
Great, thank you. And I want to thank Rand for organizing this, and the Japan House, and everyone for bringing together what is a very sort of different kind of community. I do a lot of events. Actually, I just added up. I did more than on average one a week last year. And often I feel like it sort of is like preaching to the traveling tribe. I see the same people. I see a few familiar faces here, which is great. But this is an opportunity to explain to this audience about the excitement around quantum. It is real, and I'm running an organization, as Jeffrey mentioned, that's really about getting things out of the laboratory and into practical application, making it commercially useful, and ultimately creating the industry and the economy of the future based on quantum technology. A little bit about QEDC. So Quantum Economic Development Consortium, our middle name is Economic Development, but it was created by the 2018 National Quantum Initiative Act. Congress passed that piece of legislation, and in there said that the Department of Commerce, and in particular the National Institute for Standards and Technology, or NIST, in our Department of Commerce, was to establish a consortium of stakeholders. And that's what QEDC is. So we got some, what I sometimes refer to as startup funding from the US government. Now, why did they think that was something that was needed at the time? Well, they were in the process of creating a big national initiative that was going to spend billions of tax dollars on basic research and to take what was already going on and put it under sort of one big umbrella and make it much more coordinated and whole of government. But it was going to be funded mostly on basic research. That's what the government's role is, especially. And then trying to figure out how to connect that to what was going on in the private sector. And at the time, as we heard from Jay Gambetta, and if we had more time, might hear from other companies as well, and we will from Paul later on, there was a sort of growing investment on the private side for taking the technology, the science that was has been kind of emerging for a long time at that point, and starting to commercialize it. So the government kind of recognized that they needed to be informed at least about what was going on in the private sector as they were making their priorities and their investments. And hopefully we're spending that money in a way that was going to be ultimately useful to the companies, either in the education that was happening in the course of graduate research by students who go on to work for companies, or the research itself. And one of my experiences before taking this position was in the semiconductor industry, where we did a very similar thing and invested some government and industry money into university research for semiconductor industry uses. And so this is my organization, which doesn't have a lot of resources to spend on research, is really kind of at the junction of what the government's doing. I get called upon by government. I testified to Congress last year on what is it that industry needs. On the other hand, on the industry side, I'm really trying to help identify common problems. And if you go and read the legislation that was passed in 2018, it says this consortium is to sort of look around and see what gaps there are. Gaps in the technologies, gaps in the sort of enabling technologies. We heard about the refrigerators that are needed for low temperature control. There are lasers that are needed. There are, as was mentioned, control electronics that are very expensive and sort of still rather specialty. And so what are the gaps in technology, in workforce, in standards, in policy? And my organization has brought together a community, really a trusted community from all across the ecosystem to look for those gaps and help think about how to fill them. So the community is industry driven, and we have now about 260 members, I think. I have to go to my own website, but it's all on the public website. You can find it there, a list of all these members. About 180 of them are corporate. So we're really focused on the industry piece, but it's such an emerging technology and an early stage technology and field that it's really critical to have access and connections to the universities and the government laboratories. So we have sort of membership categories for all of those types of entities. We went a couple of years ago and opened up to not just US entities, but not outside the US as well, in a very sort of deliberate way. And so we're now open to companies and research institutions from outside the US, from sort of select whitelisted countries. They're kind of, I would say, make up a lot of the world that is doing quantum today. Not so much the global South, other than Australia, and we're sort of looking for partnerships with countries or organizations that are in countries that are like-minded, and so we don't include China on that list. We don't include Russia, North Korea. But again, that's all on our public website, all of Europe. Japan certainly was among the first to be added. India was most recently added, along with others. So we have now about 50 non-US companies that are members, as well as 170 or something US members. I made a few notes here in response to the questions we were given to prepare. There was a question about impact of quantum from an industry point of view, and near term versus long term. So we heard a little bit from Jay Gambetta that in the near term, it's likely that there are going to be some very sort of specific use cases and applications that are developed. And I agree with that. I think that we're likely to see, it's not that we're going to all of a sudden necessarily have what you would call a general purpose machine that can be used to sort of solve all kinds of different problems. We'll get there eventually, I believe, but in the nearer term, we're much more likely to develop tools and approaches and algorithms and hardware that's really sort of optimized for certain problems. I don't know exactly. We've heard working on material science type problems, working on optimization problems, working on machine learning and AI type problems. These are all areas where there's a lot of work going on, and I think we're likely to see some specific examples of where quantum provides a real advantage. And then I think things will take off very quickly. So we're still in many ways, and I see this over and over, in a sort of chicken and egg kind of problem. We don't have the killer app. The people who make the components don't see a big market yet, so they don't invest their own R&D. And so it sort of perpetuates, and this is where government really can come in and help to build a bridge, to provide some of the seed funding, to be an early customer and kind of get us past this stage so that then the private applications and markets can emerge. So in terms of challenges that are being faced today, I think this problem of what are the markets is one that I hear that question a lot. My organization is doing a number of workshops this year on quantum for some particular use case. And there's a couple of reports that are on our website under the publications page on that we did last year, quantum for improving the electric grid. We partnered with the Department of Energy. We did a workshop where we brought in people who manage the electric grid. They don't know what a quantum computer might do for them, but they know about their problems, what's keeping them up at night. They're going to have a bunch of electric vehicles that they're being plugged in. They're going to have rooftop solar that's got to be integrated. This grid was not designed for this kind of purpose. And so they brought their problems to the workshop. There was a lot of brainstorming on what could quantum computers perhaps do to help solve problems. And then there was an exercise to sort of rank all of these ideas on what a quantum computer might do for using and improving the electric grid. And what we asked each of the workshop attendees, what is the feasibility of this technology? That is, where is the technology today and where does it need to be in order for this use case to be possible? And then if we get to the point where it's possible, what would the impact be? And if you look at that report, there's even some interactive online graphs, you can see there's these charts, feasibility, impact. And where you want to focus is the top right. What is really near, to being feasible and would have a high impact. And it's very interesting to see there were dozens of use cases, and what's in that top right corner. Maybe that's where we should focus today. Now, it's based on the voting of, a group of experts who we invited to this workshop, but it's a great place to start. And we're going to do that kind of workshop and identify feasibility and impact for drug discovery. And there's also quantum sensing for medical imaging that's being developed, for transportation and logistics. I think we have a report on that coming out within a couple of weeks. In the area of financial services, sometimes it's security questions and sometimes it's performance questions or ability to solve problems and disrupt a particular sector. So these questions about use case, I think, are going to really spur innovation. And I think part of the problem in this community is that you have big companies with pretty deep pockets like IBM making some significant investments, but then you have smaller companies like we're going to hear about here that don't have maybe a lot of resources. They're having to focus like a laser, and how to support those small, nimble, and innovative companies as they make progress is an area where I see real challenge and where government can perhaps help. The supply chain is fragile. Jay kind of referred to it, and we've worked in our organization to try to help strengthen the supply chain by getting information out more broadly about what the IBMs of the world need. They need these electronics that meet certain performance specifications that the electronics industry didn't know, that was a customer until recently. And so they've been making stuff for the telecom industry or for some other purpose. And the IBMs of the world are buying stuff. And I will quote somebody from IBM at one point said, "My motto is buy it and try it, because I don't know if the parts I buy are going to work." We need to fix that problem. And then finally, policy and governance issues. It was mentioned briefly, export control is a topic of interest and concern. There are governments that I will key you into a little secret, and that is the government is not a big monolithic organization. There are parts of government that are running as fast as possible to come up with new things to do with high performance computing perhaps. And there are other parts that are very interested in protecting the technology and keeping it out of the hands of others. And there's a tension and a natural sort of or balance that needs to be struck between those. So finding the right controls for this technology is an area of policy concern. And support, as I mentioned, for the small companies, the mid-sized companies and the startups who struggle for getting financing. Today, money is not as available as it once was, and the government can help. So I'll finally end with opportunities for collaboration, since we're here to talk about US-Japan areas of interest. I think there are lots of areas of mutual and complementary capabilities. We heard about HPC, or how do you say it? HPC. Cryogenics is an area where the Japanese companies have some real expertise. I work closely with, I'll mention the Japanese members in my consortium. I think I know them all. There is Toshiba, Kyocera, Hamamatsu, a small startup called Cunisys, and then a government-funded research institute, NICT. We hope that NTT Research will join perhaps. I think Nanofiber has recently joined, and others are in the pipeline. So very excited to have Japanese companies involved, and they're involved because they are interested in being part of this community and connecting to some of the system developers. Advanced manufacturing is an area where, of course, Japan has great strengths, and we did a manufacturing roadmap that's, I think, also on our website, that I think identifies manufacturing challenges for the quantum industry. Metrology and tools for doing sort of very accurate measurement and characterization is an area where we need to work together, and others. QEDC collaborates with its counterpart in Japan called QStar. So there's already a lot of business to business communication taking place. And finally, it was mentioned that I'm part of this Quad Investors Network. That is a sort of private driven group with government support and connections that aims to increase collaboration, increase investment across the borders, and increase trade and markets. And those are all things that I'm for 100%. So I'm very excited about working with the private sector and government to build connections across the Quad boundaries, which is, as was mentioned earlier, US, Japan, Australia, and India. So I'm happy to answer questions about any of those ideas that I threw out. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Goban.
So here, as I mentioned, I will introduce our company first, and then describe our technologies. So our vision of a company is to create a world where people can access quantum computing securely from anywhere through scalable quantum network. Today, we hear about the quantum network in the early sessions, so we are trying to build the technology for this quantum network. And to realize this, we utilize nanofiber cavity QED technologies and taking advantage of our unique hybrid system that combines atom and photons. The key building block will be the quantum repeaters that enable us to connect atom and photons. So in the following slides, I will introduce our basic schemes and how we interact with atom and photon in our systems. So in our platform, we can use this quantum processing units as a quantum computer on the left side, so-called distributed quantum computing scheme. So by using photon to connect several different quantum processing units. On the other hand, by sequentially connecting these QPUs, like these lines, we can create a quantum network and allow us to use as a secure quantum communication facilitated by these quantum repeaters. So in our system, these quantum computing and quantum repeater can be realized in a seamless fashion because our platform is made of fibers, so there's no chance that light goes outside from these fibers. So currently, our development focus on building these quantum repeaters, and we will describe how we realize these systems. So here's our today's agendas. First, I'll describe our company overview, and then move on to our technological details. So NanoQT was established about 1.5 years ago based on the research from Professor Aokis in Waseda University in Tokyo. So NanoQT is a very fast hardware startup in Japan to develop hardware for quantum computing and quantum networking. Also, we are one of the first startups to utilize optical cavity QED, which is based on the research that won the Nobel Prize in 2012. So that's kind of our basic structures. And the last year, we have undergone the corporate inversions from Japan to United States. So our headquarters is now registered in United States. Although currently, most of the operation is done in Tokyo, we are planning to expand our operations from Japan to the United States in following years. So within 1.5 years, we have accomplished following things. On the R&D side, we have submitted 9 patents in the United States on our own, and we recruited 7 PhDs from Japan and Europe. And recently, about a few years ago, we have completed fundraisings, obtaining about $10 million US, and quickly followed by the Japanese government grant, 3.5 million, to further accelerate our R&D processes. Especially for the fundraising, we obtained this funding from the Japanese venture capitals as well as US venture capitals. So all things done in a short span requires talented groups. So let me introduce our teams. So our CEO, Masashi Hirose, he got a PhD from MIT, worked on the NV Center for Quantum Sensing, and he spent 7 years at McKinsey afterwards. So he has a unique background, both physics and business. And he's a key figure in our companies. And I myself got a PhD from Caltech and worked on the cavity QED, and then moved on to the University of Colorado Boulder, where I developed one of the precise atomic clock using quantum gas. Then now I'm leading the R&D team shown in the below. So our R&D team is divided by a hardware team and theory teams. The hardware team in charge of building quantum repeater devices, while theory team bridges the gap between the pure theory proposal and the actual implementation in our devices. And we also have interns from MIT and Caltech, and we are open to US applicants as well. And most recently, the Professor Burdan Vertic at MIT, who is expert in this field, joined us as an external advisor to help our R&D processes. So you may wonder why we took such a radical step to undergo the corporate inversion to set the base in the United States. So the US represents overwhelmingly largest investment opportunities and also extensive academic and industrial clusters. Mainly driven by the venture capitals, the number and scale of a quantum startup in the United States is the greatest in the world. Also, the government investment is third largest following China and EU. Similarly, the number of research programs in the United States is far greater, so that supports the deep talent pools, which we wish to access. As a result, the synergy of the cutting-edge research, large investment, and deep talent pool foster an active quantum ecosystem. So collaboration with university and the industry is another area we are actively seeking. So let me switch my gear and discuss about technology and development plans. So what do we need for quantum repeater operations? First, we need to share the quantum resources between the neighboring quantum nodes, quantum processing units, and then distribute across entire network using photons. This is called entanglement distributions. And then we need to store those information locally using atoms, that's the quantum memories. During these processes, some of the information could be lost, so we need to recover using the multiple qubits, so-called entanglement purifications. Those requirements for quantum repeater operation is exactly the same as the operation for the quantum computing, such that our connectable QPU is ideally suited for quantum repeater operations. So for comparison, here we show the partial list of existing players who has been building the quantum repeaters using memories. The upper part shows that there are two major categories. One is a solid state qubits on the top and natural qubit on the bottoms. We also hear about the story here today in the morning. The major differentiator is a two key component, the cavity and the gate operations. So cavity, which control photons, is crucial for efficient information exchange between atom and photons. While atom is gate operation is necessary for error mitigations and correction down the road. So among those platforms, silicon vacancy centers, which actively developed by Amazon Web Services, AWS, and our platform meets all the requirements. In addition, our system has the advantage of operating at the room temperatures and seamless integration into the fiber network, since our platform is all fiber-based. The unique approach that we combine is neutral atom and the nanofiber cavities. So nanofiber cavity consists of two mirrors in the fibers, and those mirrors confine the photon inside. And then at the central regions, we specially manufacture this fiber down to the sub-wavelengths. So size of the fiber is about 500 nanometers. So it's smaller than the wavelengths. And this way, we can achieve strong photon-atom interactions. As you can see here, everything is made of fibers. We can seamlessly integrate into the optical fiber network. So there's no extra loss in these processes. So the strengths of a system can be summarized with following 4 points. First, hybrid system. The system enables efficient interaction between atom and photons. And second, projected large capacities. So nanofiber can be extended up to a few millimeters, so allowing us to couple thousands of atoms in a single units. And third, the full connectivities. So user can flexibly choose which atom to interact with each other, allowing us so-called any-to-any interactions is crucial for efficient operations. And finally, the fiber network integrations. As I mentioned before, our system is made of fiber, so it's straightforward to integrate into existing optical fiber network. So with these capabilities, we can use our QPU as a quantum repeater in the following. So from neighboring quantum node, incoming photon arrives at the systems, and then the photon at the telecom wavelengths can directly couple to our ytterbium atoms. This atom is laser cooled and trapped near the nanofibers. And once atom absorb these photons, we can manipulate these atomic states by using lasers and either correct the errors or control the states. And afterwards, this atom can de-emit the photons and generate outgoing photon towards the neighboring stations. So in this way, we can relay the information with corrections. Importantly, this ytterbium atom has a really long memory time. One of the longest memory time exists in the natures. So that's ensuring the high fidelity repeater operations. Then you may ask, how often do we need to put these repeater stations in a quantum network? Answer is every tens of kilometers. This is due to the loss at the optical fiber network, not from these repeater stations. So if we want to make a large-scale quantum network, we need a substantial number of repeater stations. So with this, I would like to summarize my talk, and I've finally described the current activities. So we envision to participate in a nationwide program of deploying intercity or metropolitan quantum network. And currently, we committed to develop telecom band quantum repeaters, and then we will develop the prototype machines. In parallel, we are expanding our operation in the United States, particularly the theory and software developments. And we are actively seeking for collaboration with the university and the industries to further accelerate to achieve this large-scale quantum network. So that's all for me, and thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So again, Paul Lippman, Chief Commercial Officer at Inflection. It's been a fascinating series of discussions so far today, and looking forward to telling you a bit about what we're doing and how we're also collaborating with the Japanese quantum ecosystem. So a bit about Inflection. The company was founded in 2007. We were founded in Boulder, Colorado, but we have offices today around the US. Our commercial center is in Austin, Texas. We have software operations in Chicago, quantum computing in Madison, Wisconsin, and then large presence in Oxford in the UK, most recently in Australia, and I'll talk a bit about what we do in Japan. We build quantum products. I'll show you one of those here very shortly. We have operations across a large swath of the quantum ecosystem. Perhaps one of the kind of most interesting anecdotes, maybe fun anecdotes about the company is we have an ultra-cold matter system that creates Bose-Einstein condensate, the fifth form of matter. We have one of those in the lab in Boulder you can access over the cloud. We also have one operating on the International Space Station. So it was put in a SpaceX rocket, it was launched into space, it's been operating continuously in low Earth orbit. And inside that system is actually the coldest place in the known universe, which is, I think, kind of cool. The core of what we do, really, and I brought a prop with me today, we build and develop systems like this. This is what we call an atomic prism. It's an ultra-high vacuum cell made of glass and metal. The vacuum inside what I'm holding in my hand here is more pristine than the vacuum in outer space. And this is actually the heart of a neutral atom quantum computer. So we trap atoms in here, we fire lasers at those atoms, cool the atoms down near to absolute zero, and then we can manipulate the quantum state of the atoms to carry out computation or to use this for a variety of other applications, which I'll talk about. Now, you may say, don't lasers heat things up, right? You see in science fiction movies, lasers destroying spacecraft, or you see industrial settings, lasers for welding, for example, or cutting. Actually, lasers are used to cool atoms down. If you're interested to hear more about how that happens, I'd be happy to talk about that after the presentation here. But we use lasers to cool these atoms down very close to absolute zero. We then use these same systems like the one I just showed you to create a range of quantum products. And it ranges from ultra-precise optical atomic clocks, like the one that you developed at Gila, that are between 100 and 10,000 times more precise than the world's timekeeping standard. We develop quantum radio frequency receivers, so actually using atoms to receive radio signals to create highly precise radio receivers, multispectral band analysis, and these are used for a variety of commercial and national security purposes. Quantum inertial sensors, so measuring inertial forces, acceleration, rotation, gravity for navigation purposes. And then last but by no means least, creating quantum computers using atoms as the individual qubits. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I think the title of today's session was about impact for society, impact for everyday life, of how are these quantum technologies going to change the world. And I won't talk so much about quantum computing because we've heard a lot about that so far today in terms of applications for chemistry and material science and all of the ways that it will change our lives. In the near term, though, some of the technologies that I talked about before, clocks, RF sensors, inertial sensors, utilizing quantum technology will enable us to develop new forms of navigation that don't rely on GPS. You know, you may be driving your car down the street and you lose a GPS signal, or you may be in an environment in which GPS is contested or blocked. And so for developing autonomous vehicles, for example, whether it be an autonomous car, an autonomous ship, an autonomous airplane, can't rely on GPS. And so quantum will enable us in the near future to develop position and navigation systems that work completely autonomously. New forms of biomedical sensors. You may not be aware, one of the perhaps most revolutionary forms of biomedical sensors in the last 20 or 30 years was the MRI. An MRI is a quantum system. It measures a quantum mechanical effect that happens in our bodies when a very strong magnetic field is applied. There are new forms of biomedical sensor that use quantum technologies that will take the level of visibility we have into the body, into the body's function, to a whole new level of capability. The clocks I talked about before, the inertial sensors I talked about before, will give us unprecedented visibility into the planet's climate, into mineral deposits, geologic formations for mineral, oil, and gas exploration. One of the areas I'm personally most excited about, because it is so near term and so significant, is using these very precise clocks to increase bandwidth throughput in networks, in data center networks, in optical switch networks to reduce data latency. And then lastly, solving problems in undersea and space-based navigation. So these are all near-term, real-world applications that will have general purpose applicability to society and to the economy. So one of the other topics that we wanted to touch on were what are the challenges and opportunities for companies, especially smaller companies, startup companies in these deep tech environments. So on the challenges side, we've talked a lot about the science of quantum, right? And quantum really is at the bleeding edge of science. A lot of things we've talked about really are a Nobel Prize that was won in 2012 or 2019. These are really very sophisticated scientific topics. But to build a company, to build a scalable company, you have to think not just about the science, but also about the engineering. We heard that from Jay earlier with IBM's roadmap, certainly the case for Inflection. So I then kind of break that down maybe into two categories. Probably the most significant issue in scaling quantum today, for quantum to become a large-scale industry, is supply chain. We have a highly fragmented supply chain in quantum. I was talking with Doug Fink earlier about this, hundreds of companies in the supply chain, most of which are very thinly capitalized. So it's all very well to say, well, I'm going to build one of something or 5 of something or 10 of something. How do we go to building, certainly in the case of sensors or clocks, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of these devices? Well, part of that is to have a supply chain that you can count on to deliver products with useful quality, with validation, and with lead times that are manageable in a commercial environment. One of the ways we address that at Inflection is by looking at integration, vertical integration in certain parts of the supply chain to ensure a resilient and secure supply. And then we have to think about manufacturing. How do you actually stand up manufacturing of these deep tech technologies, right? This is stuff that's never been done before. So how do you build optical atomic clocks or quantum sensors or even quantum computers and do that repeatably at scale? I think we've talked a lot about talent scarcity, workforce development. I think it was talked about this morning, the importance of bringing that not just at the PhD level, but at the master's level, at the undergraduate level, even to the high school level. We can start to make quantum more of an everyday thing. It's part of science, it's part of engineering, it's part of the way that we think about computation. How do we make that a broader base of employees for this growing industry? And then on the policy side, government is still by far and away the largest funder of quantum, and certainly the largest procurer of quantum. And so for small companies to be able to understand and work with and deal with the sales cycles and the procurement processes of governments is certainly a challenge. Companies have to get familiar with that, have to build a competency there. And I think export control was mentioned earlier, not just export control from the standpoint of US export regulations, but also alignment between companies, as this is an increasingly global business, alignment between Australia and Japan and the UK and the US to ensure that we don't stymie the development of this industry. And then on the opportunity side, you know, the analysts have talked about that this is a pre-competitive market. I think we're kind of slowly moving out maybe of that phase, but that really has led to tremendously deep collaborations, the formation of organizations like QEDC. We heard from Celia just before. Government's massive imperative to develop a domestic sovereign capability in quantum. You see government programs and funding for the US, certainly with the National Quantum Initiative. The UK just announced their missions for 2035. In Japan, also with their National Quantum Program in Australia. And increasingly, governments making very large bets in quantum. I'll talk about one of those just a second in my final slide. Academic collaboration, we heard earlier from the two professors from UCLA. At Inflection, we believe very deeply in that. We've partnered with a number of universities around the country and around the world. We do view that very much as a win-win. And then partnerships throughout the stack in delivering products to customers, working with companies that have expertise in different parts of the delivery chain, both domestically and internationally. And I'll finish here on the final slide, talking about the role that at least that we've played in collaboration with Japan. So Japan announced a while back their Moonshot program, which is a 100 billion yen program to revolutionize the society and economy and security of Japan by 2050. We were honored to be, at least so far, I think, the only non-Japanese company selected to participate in Moonshot. So the part of Moonshot, and Moonshot's not just in quantum, it's in a whole variety of very advanced kind of technological fields. So we are partnering on a program to develop a large-scale fault-tolerant quantum computer by 2050. And this is a collaboration between the Japanese government, in this case, JST, the Japan Science and Technology Agency, with academia, the Institute for Molecular Science in Okazaki, which is under NINS, who are leading the program and have some world experts in ultra-fast gates using neutral atoms. And then Inflection will be building actually a quantum computer. Probably the largest challenge will be how do we then ship that to Japan and ensure that it turns up in one piece. That's a problem for another day. But this is a fantastic collaboration between the three pillars: government, academia, and commercial. And I think a fantastic example of what we can do when we bring nations together to solve these enormous problems with such promise for society and the economy. So with that, I'll pause and we can get back to the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lippman. That was a really great talk. I learned a lot. So as usual, I'll start out with a couple questions to get things rolling, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I'd like to start with Dr. Goban, and if you could just speak a little bit about your experience working at a Japanese startup, because the Japanese quantum ecosystem, you know, there are a lot of very large companies working in that space. There are also a few startups, but relatively fewer. And I'm curious what kind of unique experiences or challenges or opportunities you experienced specifically as a startup.
Oh, that's a great question. So unfortunately, we are the first hardware startup for quantum computing networking. So there's no other example before. So for instance, we are also a part of the Moonshot program and the different categories the Inflection was part of. And actually, we are a startup, so we couldn't get the funding from the governments because we don't have any history of as a company. So because Japanese government is very traditional in some sense. So a lot of large corporate has a quantum computing R&D sections, and they got funded from Japanese government, but we couldn't at that time. So we had some like a difficulty at the beginning. At the same time, it's easier to get attention from the media or the Japanese government. So in that sense, in the different sections, we got some funding, as I mentioned. So there's always programs going as a fast like trial. It's hard to say what would be the future path that we will run.
Thank you. Mr. Lippman, you touched on this a little, but do you want to maybe comment? I know Inflection's no longer really a startup, but it's still smaller than IBM or Google and so on. Have you had any similar, unique aspects being a smaller quantum-focused company?
So I think one of the really powerful things about being founded in Boulder is it's such a hotbed for quantum activity, right? On the academic side, you have the university, you have JILA, and Colorado School of Mines, for example, that has a long history. The world's first Bose-Einstein condensate was created in Boulder, really a stone's throw from our lab, and there is a real ecosystem as well of funding for quantum. I think the biggest challenge that we faced as a startup company in this field, and we're certainly not alone in this, is the I would say competition for talent, and so being able to attract and retain and build a workforce is challenging for the quantum ecosystem as a whole, which goes back to this question of workforce development.
Thank you. One more question before we open it up, and maybe this will be for Dr. Merzbacher and Mr. Lippman. You both are at organizations that have now been in this space for quite a few years. How has the savviness of your potential customers changed or evolved, or the kind of things they're asking for? As I mentioned this morning, 5 or 10 years ago, I think very few people really knew anything about quantum technology, and a lot of people would kind of give you a blank stare if you say that's where you work in. And is that still the case? Do you still find yourself having to kind of do a 101, or do you now find that the general awareness has increased? And if so, how has that changed the kind of questions they ask or the products that they're looking for?
Well, I think it's perhaps changing slowly. There's still a lot of misconceptions. I'll kind of divide the customers into 2 categories. One is the actual end users. So part of the reason we're doing these use case workshops is to bring in potential customers or end users, because I think we can accelerate progress of the technology development if we have a good connection between the developers and the customers. The customers are not the be all and end all. There are uses that will be discovered and developed that we don't imagine. So I don't want to put sort of limits on what the developers are trying to do and develop, but customers in some sectors are getting considerably more sophisticated. I would say the 2 that are ahead in some sense are especially in the financial services sector and in the pharmaceutical sector. I had a relationship with a group that was an association of pharma companies that had formed a number of years ago to come together and develop bioinformatics tools, essentially. They realized, like, we're not the bioinformatic tool developers, we're the drug companies, but we all need these tools, so let's get together and develop them. And they think of those tools as just technology that's useful for drug discovery. And when they heard about quantum, they thought, it's another technology, and I'll just put a little bit of money into it and it'll be useful to me. And so they were somewhat naive, I think, and not very sophisticated in their understanding of the technology at that time. Fast forward a few years and they've hired people, they have some sort of in-house capability to understand and think more deeply, and they're much more knowledgeable, I would say. Now, as the reality has sunk in, I think they also recognize, it's not just something that I can sort of repurpose to what I need at this time. So there's been some shift in their approach. Same with, I would say, the financial sector. After sort of an initial flurry of enthusiasm, reality is a little bit more in play, and they're sort of steadily working on it. There are other big companies, BASF and some materials and chemical companies, who are also thinking quite strategically. I think that that's a really smart approach.
Yeah, this gets back to the hype cycle graph that Dr. Hudson showed this morning, and the peak, which is often followed by a trough, but hopefully levels off in the plateau of enlightenment.
I'll add maybe just a couple of points to that. I think our founder, Professor Dana Anderson, likes to use this term, quantum in the kitchen, by which he means that ultimately, eventually, our goal is that quantum is so commonplace, you don't think about it anymore. You'll have systems that operate in your kitchen. Dana likes to say next to the toaster. I'm not quite sure it will be quite that commonplace, but it will just be part of everyday life. We're certainly a long way from that today, but what we're seeing, and we do quite a large amount of business with governments around the world, And I think what I've seen, and I've only been in the quantum industry for 3 years, but even in that period of time, we've gone from governments kind of dipping their toes in the water at small scale in small scale research programs to now actually wanting to procure real systems, to buy sensors for deployment in the field. And that's been a real transition, I would say, in customer sophistication and comfort and adoption of technology in just a very short period of time.
Thank you. Very interesting. With that, we will open it up to the audience. Any questions from the audience? Yes, in the back row, please.
Thank you all for your time. Mr. Lippman, you mentioned that one of your projects were launched into space with a SpaceX rocket. Are there any more companies that you're okay with mentioning that you're working with to make quantum technology available to the public?
Yeah, so in that particular case, that system's not available to the public. It is available to scientists around the world. We have another one of those systems, a Bose-Einstein condensate system that we've called Octant with a Q, because everything in the quantum industry has to have a Q in it.
At least one.
At least, yeah, preferably at least one. And that one is available to the public. It's on the cloud. You can go in and create an account and create Bose-Einstein condensate and experiment with it. And that really, someone had mentioned this morning, I think there was a question about democratization of quantum. And that really was part of the objective with Octant, was to bring something which, until very recently, was the province of a small number of very kind of elite universities that had the capability and resources to build those kind of systems, and let anyone, high school students, go in and experiment with quantum. And IBM, I mean, the way that I got into quantum myself, I'll keep it very short. This was in 2019. I came across a book, Programming with the IBM, I think it was QX Experience. Like, there's quantum computers, you can program them. And IBM, I think, all credit to them for making these things available for free to the world and building the educational content around them that really open this industry up. And I hope we see more of that in the quantum industry as it develops.
Any questions from online?
Here's one for Dr. Mesbacher. There's a lot of moving parts that you have to keep track of, academic, industrial, commercial, government, just in the United States alone. It's a bit of a two-part. How do you keep track of the same developments in other countries? Are you aware of similar consortiums in other countries, and not necessarily allied countries, but other countries?
Sure. That's a good question, and it is a challenge. I rely on a lot of others who are helping to collect this information. Doug Fink is here with an organization that does sort of quantum intelligence, business intelligence, collects information that's publicly available and synthesizes and analyzes it. And there are others like that are great resources for what's going on kind of worldwide. It's very difficult this question was sort of alluding in part to what's going on in China, which according to, I think, many estimates, is a real near peer competitor to the US. The US is, a big investor, obviously. We have a lot of, that's reflected in the amount that's being spent. Collectively, Europe is doing a similar amount, I would say, perhaps even more, depending on how you measure. And it is, I don't sort of obsess about the numbers. It's a bit of apples and oranges that are being compared here. But there's obviously a lot being invested by governments. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is because it is an emerging technology. There's a lot of applications and value that is envisioned. And there's also the national security side, which we've talked about. A quantum computer at some point will be sufficiently powerful to break the encryption that we use today. And this has been known for quite a long time. And governments, and led by the US government, is working to establish new standards which will be resistant to attack by a quantum computer. So that's a whole activity that's aimed at, there's nothing really quantum about it. We've got existing IT systems. They need to have encryption that's protecting them from an attack by a quantum computer. But that threat, the government has information it wants protected. There's a lot of personal information. There's financial transaction information. We do all our e-commerce online using accounting on this type of protection and security. And all of that is vulnerable at some point in the future. We don't know how far in the future, but we need to be prepared. And so because of that, I do not see this whole concern about a quantum winter or some big drop in funding for quantum is, in my opinion, less likely because governments are not going to want to take their foot off the gas. It's not okay to be number 2 or number 3 in this area. And so I think that governments around the world see this and are making, their investments, and like-minded countries are working together. So I think that there sort of is both the beneficial uses and then the national security and protection on the table here. And there were some other questions. I saw hands all over the place. Alan.
Yeah, maybe in the second row over here.
So, like,
You wait for the microphone so people online can hear.
so other countries in Europe as well as Japan, they've already pushed very fast forward to acquire these large systems, whether it's quantum computers, et cetera. Whereas it seems like in the United States, the government's waiting. What's the reason and how do we fix that problem?
Well, again, like others, I'm going to qualify and say I'm not speaking for the US government here. But I live in Washington, D.C. I hear a lot there. And what sort of I hear in government statements in the US is that, well, number one, the company you used to work for in Google and others are making a lot of investments. And so the US government tends to let the private sector lead when it's willing and able to do so. And I think at the same time, I've seen a shift in government customers like the Department of Energy and even the Department of Defense to be more closely engaged with the development. So I say, stay tuned. I was at Oak Ridge in sort of the 2016 time period. And at that time, when I asked them, because they're building these high performance, they own a lot of high performance computers there. When I would ask them about quantum computing, they would look at it as an accelerator, an addition to the classical technology. So as Jay mentioned, a heterogeneous approach, a combination of CPUs and graphical processing units, GPUs, and quantum processing units. And I think that's actually where we'll see the US government putting its resources for the most part. Outside of the rest of the world, to some extent, I think is very intimidated by how much big tech companies in the US are investing, and governments are feeling like we've got to step up and be that investor at this point, because there isn't a Google in my country that's going to make that kind of investment. And so it's a global competition. Those countries feel like we've got outstanding university researchers, we've got a lot of infrastructure, and if we just add some fuel to that mix with some government investment, we can be the quantum Google here in country fill in the blank. And so right now, it sort of is up for grabs to a certain extent. And I think that the US government doesn't think that we're behind necessarily. And I think analyses by Rand and others have similar conclusions. But it's a dynamic situation, and certainly everybody will be keeping an eye on it.
Although I think someone should fact check me on this, but I think that NASA and JPL purchased a D-Wave quantum computer all the way back in 2010 or something. So I think, there has been some history of the United States government.
Typically subsidized by Google, actually.
Okay.
That was also an offset, by the way.
Okay. I've been fact checked as requested. Anyway, okay, next question. Third row here.
Yeah, just to expand a little bit on the foreign government, and especially from your vantage point, what's going on in Europe, and are the efforts in the same direction as as here? Are they different in different countries? And just could you expand a little bit on that?
I mean, I can jump in on that. I think we've seen certainly the first country, and although accent notwithstanding, I've lived in the US for the last 30 years. The first country to really announce a quantum strategy and invest in a significant way was the UK. And in fact, the UK has announced their national quantum program, 2.5 billion sterling over a decade. And I think they'll be stepping up from that even more significantly. And that has led to the development of really a thriving quantum ecosystem in the UK, and the recently announced 2035 missions around quantum computing, around quantum navigation, around quantum timing and sensing, I think illustrate that. I think certainly Germany and we've seen Denmark have stepped up quite significantly with their own quantum programs. And so I think we're seeing it happen on a country by country basis, but also now on a Europe-wide basis. Again, back to the comments I made earlier, I think there are issues that still need to be resolved to ensure international collaboration. Another one that we didn't touch on was the movement of people, right? In an environment in which we have fairly small still pools of trained and capable workers in quantum, the ability for people to move from the US to the UK or from the UK to Australia to participate in these programs will also be another accelerant that will enable us to continue to make this speed of progress.
Question from online.
Dr. Goban, in your opinion, how long will it take to implement efficient nanofiber quantum networks that enable communication between quantum processors?
Thank you for the questions. So that's a great point. So we are committed to demonstrate the proof of concept in FY 2025. And then we will move on to as I mentioned, we need to have a compact system to actually put every 10 kilometers. So that's the next step that we have to make the transportable systems. That's we are aiming for 2027.
In the back row.
So for classical computers, we know that the circuit components are very fungible. And so will they be the same for quantum? And what role will standards leadership play in electing dominant designs for a global quantum network?
So maybe I will ask a question on our devices. So we are using the neutral atoms. So we actually laser cool those atoms down to microkelvins and nanokelvins. So most of the fragile stuff is actually lasers. But those now there's a lot of like vendors, they can make a very compact and robust, and you can run it 24/7. So it's different devices, but indeed we have some chance that will break every once in a while. But I think it's quite different from this superconducting qubit case where you have to operate at low temperatures.
Dr. Merzbach, would you like to hit on the standards question?
Yeah, actually, on the sort of supply chain question, there are real differences technology to technology. And so as long as we haven't sort of settled, and we may never, there may be some applications where it makes sense to use an ion-based system versus a superconducting system. So the jury is still out. So there's a lot of different supply chains underneath each of those technologies. On the standards front, there's, I think we're already seeing some development of what I call standards, maybe with a little s, as opposed to the sort of formal technical standards that, again, tend to be developed when there's a clear product and a market and the need for interoperability among different components. Things are still a little bit early stage for those kinds of, let's lock into one standard. But there's a need for having common, taxonomy, to have common metrics for reporting the performance of components. And some of those kinds of standards. I've been working actually with someone on creating something called sort of a standardization readiness level taxonomy that would say, when is the right time to get together and create standards? Because it takes a lot of work and time and effort to develop standards. And if you do it too early, then that can be just waste of time. If you do it too late, then it can be very expensive to people who standardized on one standard and now it's another. So it's a sort of complex field of specialization in a way. And in general, although there are some areas where things are perhaps a little bit farther along, like quantum key distribution that's been around for a while, some standards are being developed. So that's another point I think to make, is that we throw around this word quantum or quantum technology, but there are a lot of quantum technologies and some are a little bit more mature than others.
Thank you. Question from online, please.
Dr. Lippman, you've alluded several times to education at different tiers. What will you do to incentivize quantum education at these different tiers, if you had?
Well, if there's a question of what will I do personally, what would the company do, what would the industry do? I think kind of industry wide, certainly we're investing in programs to educate and bring in and democratize and make these technologies available on a very broad basis. Also developing products that can help to facilitate education, both at the university level and even potentially at the high school level. Certainly sponsorship of educational programs for developing content and for developing educational materials. And as I say, I think quantum is accessible even at the high school level, certainly for learning the basics of quantum computation, learning the basics of quantum mechanics and quantum behavior. But I think it's not just developing the next generation of quantum scientists, of physicists, but it's quantum awareness on a very broad basis, whether it's in computer science, it's in electronics, it's in marketing, it's in business development. It's really on a broad basis of people who we need to bring into the industry with the capability to add value in this growing ecosystem.
I have a little bit of a follow-up on my own on this one. Do you see a parallelism maybe to a lesser degree to the Eisenhower administration in the 50s or something, like, oh, we got to catch up with the Soviets because they're putting rockets on, not on the moon, but satellites and so on and so forth. That sort of incentivization.
Yeah, so I would say we've seen a couple of examples of this, and I'm kind of talking here a little bit outside of my area of experience. In the UK, for example, the UK has created these centers of doctoral training to incentivize and fund the development of PhD positions on a fairly broad basis, but I think a large chunk of that funding specifically to quantum. We do have incentives in the National Quantum Initiative in the US to fund education, both again at the graduate level, undergraduate level, and also at the high school level, and certainly funding for community colleges, for the kind of disadvantaged communities to bring them into the quantum workforce. I don't think we're moving anywhere near fast enough or at a high enough scale, which is why industry has such an important part to play there.
I'll add to that answer and say that a few years ago, I have a committee at QEDC on workforce and education. And several years ago, we did a survey of all the companies and said, what jobs are you going to be filling in the next few years? And they had a big menu and they could add others if it was missing. And then for each job that they checked, we said, what skills do you want this person to have? And what degree would you imagine that would be preferred? And so we had a big sort of set of data, jobs, skills, and degrees. And we analyzed that. And the conclusion was that most of the job titles did not have quantum in the name, software engineer, photonic engineer, and so on. And there were marketing and sales and or less technical positions as well. In the skill set, again, the skills were not quantum physics for the most part. They were traditional engineering and science understanding. So the conclusion was that, and most of the degrees that were preferred were not PhDs. So this sort of broke the whole myth, and I would meet students often at meetings who would come up and say, I'm really excited and I hear about this quantum field, but I don't have a PhD in physics. Like, that's okay. There are many jobs that don't require a PhD in physics, but that word wasn't getting down to the students very well, and I think that's still true. The analysis that we did, we published, and it, I think, was fairly well received and widely read at the university educator level. And so we saw, like the UCLA master's program, that kind of program being developed where it would be a combination of traditional engineering with some quantum knowledge. That's exactly what companies are looking for. And so I think we've started to develop curricula that meet the needs of the industry. It's a role that my organization can play to continually sort of update and get the word out. I'd like to figure out ways to better get that word out to the potential employees, AKA students, so that they will, channel their interest and enthusiasm into a path. And we're going to put something up on our website, a career pathways interactive tool in the coming year. Doug, you may be working on that, or Don. So we can help to educate students and let them know, here's how you can go from where you are now into a quantum career in the future. And I will say that my, as a person who did policy for a while, my sort of position on the National Science Foundation in the US, which funds a lot of university research, of course, was that it used to be, when I was doing science as a researcher, funding research to advance science. But I really came to appreciate that it is a workforce development agency, because by funding research at universities, who does that? Students, and they graduate and go to work. So it's building that pipeline, and just like the UK has their doctoral education program, I mean, that's what the NSF does. It supports PhD students in their research. So the more they fund and call for proposals from universities that includes quantum, the more students will be working on quantum and will come out of that system. But it does take time.
And I believe the CHIPS and Science Act explicitly directed NSF to expand beyond just the traditional research funding, I believe. So yes, there's a constantly changing story within the government. Other questions? Yeah, back there, please.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful lecture. Coming from the entertainment industry, naturally, my question is about art and quantum science. I don't know whether you watch movies like Tenet. Tenet deals with entropy, Maxwell's demon, a lot of these quantum themes, or even other Christopher Nolan movies like Interstellar or Oppenheimer, or as Dr. Parker mentioned, Quantumania, Marvel. How do these movies or work of fiction affect what you do, or how do you see it affect the industry in general?
I mean, I think I'll echo what was said maybe by Paul, that we need to be sort of going both deep and broad, and that's more the broad communication. It's a piece of that, getting the sort of general public comfortable with this idea, because it's hard to understand. And I sometimes point out that we think of quantum as this sort of special niche of science, but in fact, in our everyday lives, if you get down to small enough scales, everything around us really follows quantum behavior. And so you have to kind of get comfortable with that notion in a way. And I also will point out that it's almost more amazing that we are able to represent this dynamic analog world of sound and color and shades of gray with ones and zeros. I mean, that's amazing. Quantum is much more naturally about sort of analog and shades of gray and statistical variation. And so I think not everybody has to understand the quantum physics, but I think it's going to end up just finding its way into all kinds of things. And the entertainment industry not only has a role through its representation, and I have to say the only of those movies that I've seen is Oppenheimer, but also through its sort of making things more familiar. And so thanks and good credit to, and there's, just so you know, there's every day something called the World Quantum Day, I think it is, in April. And 2025, I think, is going to be the year of quantum, based on the UN, which sponsors these kinds of things. And that's really an opportunity to communicate very broadly and have sort of grassroots things going on in lots of different venues and communities.
I'll just add one thought. I think maybe the entertainment industry, the creative industry, there's a really important role to play in conveying the beauty and the wonder and just the incredible reality of what quantum mechanics is and how nature operates on this most fundamental level. John Martinez is starting it. That's fantastic. The ability to image an individual atom, the ability to cool atoms to a hair's breadth above absolute zero, the kind of things that you did in your PhD in creating atomic clocks that have an accuracy of 1 second in the age of the universe. To be able to convey this to society at large, I think is really that's the domain of the creative world, of the entertainment industry. And I think just society gets richer as a result of that.
Let's take one more question from online, maybe, and then come back to the audience.
One for Dr. Merzbacher. With QEDC identifying gaps in the quantum ecosystem, has there been a gap that has surprised you negatively or positively?
Well, I mean, I think this workforce gap, getting some clarity on that was eye-opening. Almost every event and workshop and thing that we do is a bit eye-opening, and you go in with some assumptions, of course. In the case of the use cases for improving the electric grid, one of the ideas that came out of the people who manage the grid was, well, if only quantum computing could help us anticipate things better. Faults on the grid, when your power goes out, that's a bad day for them. And so they were sort of throwing out that particular problem. How can we do a better job of anticipating outages so that we can prevent them from happening? That's an example of something that was a use case that I hadn't thought of, and I bet most of the people in the room who were coming from the quantum side weren't even aware was something that maybe they should be thinking about. So, I mean, generally, I'm always excited to hear, what ideas people have for this technology. And again, I think that highlights how hard it is to anticipate where we'll be. The question that came earlier, what's the quantum world or my world going to look like in 10, 20 more years? Because of quantum, it's really hard to predict. Here's the question.
Let's go over here.
I just had a quick comment.
Wait for the mic, please.
I just had a quick comment for the fellow from the entertainment industry, which was there is the science to entertainment exchange, which I believe is run out of UCLA, which is basically a Rolodex of PhDs from various STEM fields that consult for Hollywood and the entertainment industry on various topics. Maybe a practical route that is to try and get on road more quantum specialists and SMEs onto that Rolodex.
Thank you. Was there a question over here? Okay, second row.
Please deepen my understanding of the universe as per the subtext of the earlier session, and respond to spooky action at a distance. You know what I mean?
Wow, what a way to end the day. I'll caveat by saying that I'm not a scientist. I'm a business person. I think the question, this is one of the examples, for example, when we talked about the role for the creative industry and the entertainment industry, this concept of entanglement it's every day in what we do, right? In our quantum computers, in what you do with the networking, with IBM's quantum computers, we almost take it for granted. And it's a fundamental in the way that nature works at the most basic level. It's unfortunate that it was given the name spooky action at distance. I think it was Einstein who coined that name, because that's not actually what it is. There is no way to send information, for example. It's not action at a distance. It's to do with the fundamental nature of reality and how quantum entanglement works. So there's no faster than light travel, there's no faster than light communication, but there is this amazing thing called entanglement that enables us to do things like quantum computation that really will change the world.
I think quantum entanglement's a good example of something stranger than any science fiction author possibly could have come up with until it was discovered in the nature.
And it's a good example of how the theorists who were trying to describe things sort of with mathematics and the language of math came up with these theories that the experiments have proven over and over. It's still kind of a theory, but every experiment kind of solidifies the theory as true, or, you know, and so that's a sort of example of the progress that's made in the field over time.
Double slit experiment.
Mhm.
Question from online.
I think you might all want to have something to say about it. If you had the ears of the Japanese government or the American government, how would you go about telling them, okay, your first order of business is to do this, and then that, and then that, and then that, to give quantum a boost?
That's a tough question. I think probably I'm not the right person to answer. Probably some of you has better experience with talking to the government.
But I think the question is, what do you need? What would
Yeah.
if you could sort of wave a magic wand, what would you like them to do from where you sit?
I mean, always the government funding was a
Funding.
great start, and also the collaboration with the university and the research institute. Yeah, that's always we are seeking for the opportunities.
I'll add to that. I think, and I've actually been really impressed with the level of engagement and the level of strategic priority that the governments, at least the ones we deal with, principally the US, Australia, Japan, and the UK, are really putting quantum front and center. I think what is necessary for this industry to really meet its true potential is for governments to become customers, not just funders of research, but ultimately customers buying commercial products at commercial scale. We're starting to see that happen, and I hope we continue and we see that accelerate.
I'll push back on that a little bit, because I think that you don't want to distort the market. That's the US government's position generally. And so, you know, coming in, you could say, well, we're going to put solar on everybody's rooftop, the government's going to pay for it, and then they stop, and then there's a crash, right? So there has to be, I've seen that sort of, let's throw some money at it approach not always work. So I think it's appropriate to be a customer when you have something that you need to buy, and sort of be an early customer who's willing to pay top dollar. And that's what I think I see the government doing. They are buying navigation systems. They're willing to spend money on non-recurring engineering costs to get that first edition of something, but they want to have some sense that it's something that is going to serve a need of the government. Now, I will say not all of the departments have a lot of understanding and knowledge how quantum maybe could help them. The Department of Transportation maybe has transportation system problems that could be addressed. And so again, that's where you need to engage with those customers and help them to think creatively about how how they could be an early customer.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I'll further refine my comment, which is to say the government as a customer of real products that solve real problems, for which there absolutely are in quantum today, certainly in the sensing and the timing area.
If I could ask a somewhat provocative follow-up, is there anything that any of you all would like to see the government stop doing? Is there anything, regulation or red tape or anything there?
I mean, I have actually a sort of different dream in this area. My organization is not a government organization, even though we have partnerships and even get some funding. But we admit new members with some review and consideration. So as I said, we're building a trusted community. And in that process of doing a review, I even consult with government agencies and law enforcement to make sure that they don't know something about this organization that might be problematic. And so we do our due diligence and then we bring in a new member. Those questions and that sort of review that we do, I wish would allow my members to have maybe some expedited process through getting a visa for immigration or getting an SBIR proposal reviewed and approved perhaps. So if there were some of the questions I'm asking are the same questions that these other processes are asking, let's short circuit that and to get rid of some of the red tape, especially for small companies. And the government will often say, your companies, your members don't have to worry about it. They'll get it, you know, the license will come, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, wait a minute. You are saying that a small company has to hire somebody whose job it is to track some application through the government system and wait and wait and wait. And when they hear back, then they can, you know, go ahead and make the sale or do some next step. This is a big tax on a small company that's trying to move quickly. And so I'm always trying to remind our friends in government who are doing their job, they're trying to do a good job, that they should kind of be as light touch as possible in their work.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. Yes, right there.
Thank you. Just wanted to ask you where the conversation is right now in the about the ethics of quantum computing. I know that the National Institute of Sciences, I think there've been reports about this. You know, and with AI, we seem to have woken up very late to the sort of dark side of AI and the malicious use of such technologies. So how are you going to avoid that?
So my organization actually has a committee that has a new subcommittee on ethics in this area. So that happens because the members of the organization have some interest and they come together and say, we want to form this new group. I don't dictate it. So that tells you right there that the industry is already kind of aware of this need for consideration about ethical issues and use. I will say that as a technologist myself, I see this as a platform technology that may be a platform for more powerful AI or some other use that has both beneficial and nefarious applications. And that's always true with new technologies. And so I think in the US, we tend to be more optimistic, you could say, or tech positive. I remember, I will just share this little story. I used to run a nanotechnology initiative out of the White House, and I went to a very early international nanotechnology group meeting, and there were people there from Europe and from the US and from Japan. And someone from Europe got up and said, well, we're very concerned about these nanomaterials getting into the environment and into the body, and we think we need to be very cautious and, you know, be sure we understand everything about them before we allow them to be used in various products and so on. And the person from Japan got up and said, yeah, our, you know, people in Japan are also very interested in this nanotechnology. They want to know how soon I can have it. So the different sort of approach to emerging technology in these different cultures, different countries, was apparent in that little exchange, I thought. And the US is maybe somewhere in the middle, but I think it's impossible to anticipate every use. And so having the conversation, having the forums where people are sharing concerns and information is what's needed at the early stages, so that appropriate controls can be put in place. And as you noted, things can move very quickly in some cases. And so kind of having the expertise and the dialogue now is, I think, appropriate. But again, it's sort of like standards. You don't want to move too quickly with putting controls in place when you don't really know where the technology is going ultimately. Is there a follow-up question, or are we cutting people?
I think
We are at time.
I think we should thank our panel for a really great conversation.
So I would like to ask the panelists to please take a seat, and Teddy and I are going to close out the day's events here. So before we give a few closing remarks here, I do want to express the thanks, my personal thanks, as well as the thanks of RAND as an organization to our panelists, our keynote speaker, all our audience members that have stuck around through the whole day, both in person as well as online. We've had an enormous turnout online, and the numbers have remained even during lunch. 45 people just stuck around at lunch, even though there was nothing happening in the room. So let me give the floor quickly to Teddy to provide a couple of his closing thoughts, and then I'll come back and provide a couple of my closing thoughts, and we will bid farewell for the day. So, Teddy.
Thank you very much. So first, I'd like to thank all of our speakers. They were all really great. Let's just give them all a round of applause. Second, I'd like to thank all of you for turning out, both in person and online. Great questions, great turnout, great participation. I think this really could not have gone better. I'll just close with kind of 4 very high-level points that I took away from the day's conversations that is maybe some food for thought to go away with. The first recurring theme was the really close connection between universities and industry. I think what we saw is there's really not a clean line here. This is an industry that used to be entirely in universities. Now it's, really dynamic interplay between universities and industry, but we see there's not a sharp line between them. The same people work in both. We had some, people in the morning panel in particular who kind of have a foot in both camps at once. So it's really fascinating to see that interplay. The second thing I wanted to, recurring theme, I think, is just there's a lot of fundamental questions to be answered about this technology and a lot of basic science to be done. So I think while we're, in a fascinating stage where industry is, really charging full force ahead to get products and sell things, there are many different approaches that are all being explored in parallel. I think there's a lot of really basic questions to be answered. And, this is still very much a science research topic as well as an industrial technology topic. I think it's really interesting, again, to see the interplay between those two different approaches in two sectors, which I think will continue to evolve in a kind of self-reinforcing and interacting way moving forward. The third thing, which is closely related, it's a twist on that, is, quantum science is more than just science. It's also more than just technology. This is not just a question of deepening understanding of the science or even solving engineering problems, although those are both very important. What we tried to give you all a flavor of at this talk is just what a complicated and multi-dimensional ecosystem this is. Just in these 2 panels and the keynote address, we talked about workforce, we talked about policy, government action, we talked about diplomacy, international relations, business, and very concrete business-like questions like developing markets, reaching out to customers, education at all levels, the supply chain. It's just such an incredibly complicated and multifaceted topic. I think it's really great we got to touch on so many different dimensions. So I hope that you'll all walk out not just thinking kind of this is a technical topic that you need to read a bunch of textbooks to understand. And then the final aspect of that point is more than just scientists will need to chip in for this effort to succeed. So as I think someone said, I hope no one walks out of here thinking, well, I'm not a scientist, so there's nothing I can do to advance this industry. We need so many people on the government side, the policy side, the marketing side, sales, engineers of all different types at all of different levels of education and formal training in quantum. So I think every single person here, could actually help advance this ecosystem, if only by tweeting out what an awesome conference they just went to and spreading awareness. And the fourth thing, I think this came up several times in the comment, and I'm glad it did, was the question of responsible deployment, ethics, democratization, making sure everyone has access to this new technology. And I'm really glad that we're talking and thinking about these questions at a fairly early stage before kind of our path gets locked in. Because historically, technologies have not always, people have not always thought through all the ethical impacts and ramifications before developing the technology. So I'm glad that we're having those conversations now while quantum is still at a fairly early stage. Just as a small example, I think it's really interesting to hear about the possibility that quantum computing will have a really positive environmental impact. It's one story which I think is not that well known and not necessarily what the average person would think about when they hear quantum. So I think it's good to kind of get those messages out for positive social impact in the United States and in Japan. And then finally, the last thing is just, it's great to see all the interconnections between the US and Japan here on so many different levels. And I hope that this conference kind of did a small part to make that tie even tighter moving forward. Thank you.
Let me just close with a couple of prepared remarks. As a non-expert, quantum technology holds an enormous amount of promise for the betterment of mankind. There's still a lot of uncertainty regarding its full impact on society, as well as what the most challenging issues that may be associated with as it becomes more integrated into our lives. We can't say for sure what the real application, the full application of quantum technologies might be, but that's also the exciting part, given that it's inevitable that there are some applications that are still unknown and waiting for us. Understanding and developing quantum technology's full potential will require more research, not just across institutions, but across countries. Two such countries are the United States and Japan, which is what brought us here together today. Based on the experts that we heard from today representing both these countries, I am confident in the belief that there are many companies and academic institutions that are doing the type of research in fundamental quantum science that will lead to bigger and better breakthroughs in the years ahead. And when we look ahead to that future, as researchers in both countries look to their counterparts across the Pacific Ocean, I believe there is a strong foundation upon which to integrate different disciplines with this strength in quantum science to ensure not just greater technological discoveries, but to translate these discoveries, and per the title of this conference, to harness quantum technology for the benefit of society. Now, let me close by offering my thanks to people who made today possible. Teddy and I are essentially really good ringleaders at bringing everybody here and getting the trains moving on time. But this would never have happened today, first of all, if it wasn't for our partners, the Consulate General of Japan in Los Angeles, as well as the Japan House Los Angeles. So thank you very much. And then there's a host of people who I want to thank personally because they help make today work. People who you've seen floating around the room, maybe helped you get through the door, helped you with your tickets. Jonathan, Kate, Rob, James, Mark, Nick. There are so many people who helped Teddy and I make sure that everything was going the way it was supposed to go, that we would never have been able to do this by ourselves. So thank you for all of you. Finally, I would just like to remind all of you that we will send out a survey after the event, everyone who's registered in person as well as online. Again, it's about a 2-minute survey just to gauge your interest in future events so that we can help work with our partners on developing the next event. So thank you for sticking around all day today, and safe travels home.